started, I'm so excited to see so many people here today. My name is Vivian Agnew, and I am a co-coordinator of the American Democracy Project, and I'd like to welcome you to our very first time stock of this new semester. What we have for you today is pretty exciting. We have Dr. Brinker, who works in the Docking Institute. We have Dr. Chapman Rackaway, who works in the Political Science Department, and they are going to talk to you about a survey that the Docking Institute recently completed about the kinds of policies that Kansans actually support. So I want you to give them your full attention, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I think we've got a really interesting presentation for you. What policies do Kansans really support? Why are we asking this? Is because we're going to present some research that Dr. Rackaway and I have been doing for several years now that consistently shows that our legislators in Topeka are not giving Kansans what the majority of Kansans want. It's almost uncanny. We got a little late start, so I'm going to jump right into it. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the Docking Institute is. We're a social research center, as you can see in Custer Hall. We're in the second floor up there, and we're a social research center, and our mission is to help any government, agency, or nonprofit. You know, a county government, city government, state government agency, they have needs for research, as well as nonprofits. And you know, nonprofits are generally organizations that have a mission to help the public in some way. So that's what we do, is we support them by giving them research services at highly competitive costs. We're staffed by 4 permanent or full-time academics, myself, also Mike Walker, I just saw him walk in, he's our assistant director. We also have an administrative specialist. Dr. Jen Sun is our chief research scientist. And then we most recently hired Bradley Pendergast, who was a graduate of Fort Hays State, got his master's degree at Wichita State, and came back, and he's running our telephone survey center now. We also hire many students. We generally keep about 5 that work up front with us, processing data and helping us with reports. Generally, we recruit them through internships. But then I mentioned our calling center, and you'll see a picture of it in a minute. We hire up to anywhere up to 100 students, depending on how busy we are, to work as interviewers in our calling center. In addition to helping nonprofits and government entities, we have a public affairs mission. And the way the purpose of it is to promote what we think society should be: an open, informed, and democratic society. We feel like that this is what our country was based on, and these are the principles that are most important to pursue. How do we support our public affairs mission? Is basically through our survey research that we do. And of course, Kansas Speaks is what we're going to show you the results of today. This is a statewide survey that we do every fall. And then also we're going to see some results from a more recent gun survey that you may have participated in. Anybody remember doing the student gun survey 3 months ago? We're going to show you some results. Actually, I believe we've got I can't remember if it's the student or staff, because we also surveyed similarly the faculty and staff. So we're going to show you some results from that. And basically the purpose of this is to encourage discourse. This is why this is an ideal venue for us. And we've been, I've been on a couple of local TV shows. I went and gave a presentation to the Sunshine Foundation Fellows in Wichita a couple weeks ago. So we're trying to get this out to as many movers and shakers and policymakers as possible. And of course, you being here, you are all future movers and shakers of the state. So it's very important that we disseminate this information to you too. Just quickly, Kansas Speaks, I just want to point out this is a highly scientific survey that is highly valid. How come it is? We have a large sample size. And of course, with survey research, the smaller your sample size, the less reliable your results are. So we have small sample sizes that give us small margins of error. So we're very confident, relatively speaking, that our data actually does represent the opinions of Kansans. We use a computerized system. You can see there's a picture of one of our calling center labs. We have a similar room across the hall with more computers, and we actually just installed an overflow. This computer manages the sample. In other words, it keeps track of how many times we've called everybody and whether we need to call them back or not. The surveyors just read the survey question right on the screen, read it to the respondent, get the answer, and key it in. It gets keyed in right into the database. Our interviewers are largely students here that you can, of course we're not hiring now because things have kind of slowed down, but we've got some big projects coming up. If you need a job, you might watch the JobX link on Tiger Tracks, because when we need people, we'll post that announcement in there. And then we do demographic analysis. Another reason we know this is valid is because we check the income ranges, the education ranges, the gender ratio, and match that to what we know Kansas is, and they always come very close. In other words, the same proportion of rich and poor people in our survey is the same proportion in the population. So all of these things together give us high confidence that these data are very representative of Kansas residents.
Where do you get your phone numbers?
We get that from a professional sampling vendor. There are professional people who maintain large databases, and we tell them we need random households in Kansas. How many? And they of course they charge a small fee, and they provide, and they're professional at giving us representative samples as well. Okay, the first issue that we're going to, and you know what you're going to see here is the theme, is we're going to basically present what the legislature and the government state government has been giving us in the way of policies, and then we're going to contrast that with our survey results to show you consistently that the policies we're getting only represent a majority of Kansans. So Dr. Rackaway and I are going to kind of flip back and forth from here now, and so I'm going to let him talk to you about tax policy.
Before I talk about tax policy, I'm going to talk generally about the value of Kansas Speaks and what it means to a democracy, because that's part of the mission of Time Talk. When the framers of the Constitution wrote the document, one of the things that they expected would happen was a regular stream of communication between the governors, the elected officials, and their constituents. That was why they built in things like the franking privilege to the first article of the Constitution and so on, so that open dialogue would happen. But despite the fact that we have more and more convenient avenues of communication available to us than ever before in human history, we communicate with our elected officials less than at any time in this nation's history. And so there has been a huge divide that has emerged between the governed and those who govern. And so things like Kansas Speaks can serve to bridge that gap, informationally speaking, between the constituents and the people that we elect. When we vote every 2 or 4 years, it's an incredibly blunt instrument, up or down. But on the day-to-day act of governing, there's a lot more nuance involved. And normally, elected officials don't get the opportunity to do this. Any given representative in the state of Kansas doesn't have the ability to, with their limited budgets, to conduct a poll of their own constituents. So we can do that for them, and it's one of the most exciting things that I get to do as part of my participation in Docking Institute as a policy fellow. And we also benchmark these survey questions against those that are asked by national surveys and by other state surveys as well, so that we get some external validity to the data, and there's consistency there in how you ask the questions. If you know anything about polls or are interested in it, it is incredibly easy to bias polls. So we take a lot of time to deliberate and make sure that the questions, especially the technical questions about public policy, are well crafted so that they're neutral and that they try to elicit the responses that we want to. What we do know from nationwide polling is that the most important issue to every voter, almost exclusively throughout time, has been economics. And so here in Kansas, we put a spotlight on that since the election of Sam Brownback in 2010, because part of Brownback's campaign promises were a package of reforms called the Glide Path to Zero, which was a gradual ratcheting down of the state income and corporate taxes to zero, matching a benchmark state he'd established, Texas, which he claimed would help bring more businesses to Kansas, more jobs, and help build our population. Now, if you paid attention to the news, you know that that is an incredibly divisive, controversial issue. And so it's important for us to put it first. We've also had a few years under the initial rollout of the Glide Path to Zero to see what its effects are. So we have some pretty interesting findings here. And what Kansas Speaks shows is that when you ask who should bear the majority of the tax burden, the answer is very clear: not me. Seriously, that's what our responders say. Top income earners and large corporations, nearly 2/3 of all respondents to each one of those say increase taxes on those. But the middle class and small businesses, no, we get either a majority or a near majority saying reduce the tax burden on them. So when you look at our demographics, very much it is saying put that tax burden on higher income people, on larger corporations, than it is on, or than it should be on the middle class and on small business owners. But there's a lot more to tax policy as well. So Gary, if you would
Just to point out,
advance me.
9%, only less than 10% of the people are supporting the tax policies that we currently have.
So how effective has Governor Brownback's tax plan been? And with a couple of caveats, that the plan that he proposed got significantly changed in the state Senate, and it hasn't even been fully implemented yet. We'll get back to that statement in just a bit. But has it been successful? We gave 2 degrees of success, a neutral option, and then two degrees of failure. And you can put the hashtag epic fail on this one, because 61% of our respondents combined said that it has been a failure. And partly that's due to the fact that the decrease in state taxes was not matched by a commensurate amount of new jobs, and therefore compensatory tax revenue going into the state budget. So as a result, the state general fund has dropped from over $6 billion down to $5.3 billion, with the possibility of it dropping below $5 billion with rescissions from this year's budget based on our inability to make tax revenues. So we would expect that those numbers may actually get bigger as time goes on, for reasons that we'll get to in a couple of more slides. But we have more information about the tax policy as well. Anything you want to weigh in on this before we move to the next?
These data were collected before the recent increase in sales tax.
That's true.
And also just pointing out, you'll see, you can't even really see.
And we'll talk about sales tax again in a minute.
You can't even really see the red line there for tremendous success.
Yeah.
1 or 2 people out of 800 called it a tremendous success.
0.2%.
And we may have actually sampled Governor Brownback for all we know.
Yeah, we might have gotten the Lieutenant Governor's family here. Not quite sure. But one of the things, today, I'd highly recommend, if you haven't, read the Wichita Eagle. There's an editorial in it today where it calls Kansas's taxes on food one of the shames of the nation. And that aligns with this question, because many states around us have looked at their tax code and said that one of the most regressive taxes possible, one that disproportionately hits lower income earners, is that on food taxes. And there have been a number of legislators on both sides of the aisle. Both Barbara Ballard and Michael O'Donnell, Democrat and Republican, have introduced bills to drop our food sales taxes. But they haven't found much purchase in the legislature, partly because they're trying to have make goods on these revenues. But a lot of people, in fact a simple majority, say that food should be completely exempt from sales tax. So the public in Kansas would support a reduction in taxes, but clearly there is a misalignment between where the governor's view of where taxes should be and where the public thinks the taxes should be. And I shouldn't even say the governor, because now the governor has kind of become a minor player in it. He's been reelected, he's a lame duck, he's not going to be in office past 2018. And it's the state legislature who in many cases want to cut taxes even further than the governor's initial glide path to zero recommendation. So we should really lay this as much down on the state legislature as anyone. They're the ones that have been fighting on decreasing taxes on food and groceries. Expect to see that in this legislative session, which just started about 2 weeks ago. I think we're going to see this bill come up, and it's during an election season. It's going to be a lot harder for people to vote against this.
Just point out one thing, only 12% of our respondents support the sales tax policy that our legislators have implemented for us. Also, I want to point out that not only does sales tax, is it regressive? In other words, the less money you make, the bigger percentage of your income you pay in sales tax. Groceries is a huge proportion of a poor person's budget. On top of that, there's also a competing economic theory to what is being followed by our legislature, a top-down, trickle-down theory that says that increasing sales tax will cause a drag on the economy, and this is because poor people spend all of their money. And if you increase if you increase taxes on most of the items they'll buy, they will spend less. Wealthy people spend what they want. They don't care how much sales tax they pay. It will not affect their spending.
I just wanted to add, I was a little bit surprised when I moved to Kansas because the previous state that I lived in had no sales tax on food whatsoever.
You really notice it, don't you?
My grocery bills are a lot higher.
Yes, that's when you really feel that sales tax, because you make a major purchase like your weekly or bi-weekly groceries, and you really notice that difference. One other tax slide
Absolutely.
here.
And so one of the things that we wanted to see is generally, where do people think of their own tax burden? And not surprisingly, most people favor lower taxes for themselves. And you look at this, we've got 61% of our respondents say that they want lower taxes and spending generally. There's only 2% who favor much higher taxes and spending. It's fairly evenly divided, but it's still just under 20% favor an increase in taxes and spending. So in some ways, the legislature will point to this and say, this is our justification. This is why Speaker of the House Ray Merrick has said on a number of occasions that he does not believe that Kansas has a revenue problem under our new tax regime, that we have a spending problem. Now, whether that is the case or not, I want you to kind of put a mental pin in this, because as voters and as respondents to surveys, we can say things that sometimes come out as inconsistent. So I want you to remember that we want lower taxes generally, and I'm going to refer back to that later on with another one of our slides. But right now, we've wrapped up taxes, and Gary is going to take over talking about another non-controversial, nice little issue, Obamacare.
Yeah, they have given half of what the people want. They've given them lower taxes, but the problem is they didn't lower spending, and that's why you hear about the huge budget deficit that we're now having to raise sales tax and still struggling to fill. Most of you are pretty probably familiar with the Affordable Care Act, otherwise called Obamacare, and as you may know, I think it's pretty hard to argue against the fact that the Kansas legislature, as well as the governor, have generally been opposed to virtually all components of the ACA. Specifically, states had the option when it was first implemented to create their own statewide exchanges, which arguably would facilitate enrollment. We declined that. We declined Medicaid. Part of it was allowing you to expand Medicaid to income categories that didn't qualify, that made too much to qualify, but still not enough to get out of poverty. So they declined that. And so consequently now Kansans are paying a chunk of their federal income tax into the federal government, and they're not getting those dollars back because we have declined Medicare. Also, many economists would tell you that if you increase health care provision, you're going to put more people to work, that would actually have a stimulating effect on the economy.
And let's also be fair to the state legislature here, is that the package of reimbursement for Medicaid expansion and the ACA, the deal with the federal government is that 90% of a state's costs are reimbursed by the federal government for the first 10 years. But after that, there's no guarantee that that 90% reimbursement maintains. And if you look at the history of Medicare, you look at the history of Social Security, pre-reform for welfare in 1995, the federal government has a nasty habit of starting you at 90, 95, maybe even 99%. And we're at the point now where I believe for Medicare, it's somewhere around 66%. So we may be foregoing some of that tax money, but at the same time, what someone in the legislature will tell you is that the amount of money that we may have to make up as a state, which is even harder to budget, may far exceed the amount of money that we would receive from the federal government. So we have to remember that that does cut both ways.
Okay, so there is a counter argument there. But as I see here, Kansas Speak shows that even though we've largely rejected Obamacare, This chart right here shows that 62%, almost 2/3, either strongly or somewhat support expanding Medicaid. That's specifically expanding Medicaid. Funding for public education. Everybody here is in public education, right? Fort Hays State is a public university, and so funding from the state directly affects you. Many people would argue that the less funding we get from the state, the more President Martin is going to have to raise your fees. And this is, of course, dealing with K through 12. The legislature recently decided that, you know, there was a complex formula for deciding what school districts got what money. And it was kind of complicated because it had a different factor for things like the poverty level of the county, how many disabled students you had, what are some other, there's
Rate of population growth, rate of diverse populations,
it counted
percentage of students, let's see, accepted and enrolled in Kansas colleges as a byproduct of those schools. There were a total of 138, I believe, different variables within the state funding equation. I mean, it was significant.
That does sound complicated. 138 factors.
Yeah.
I was not aware of that.
Yeah.
But basically, you know, it was to try to design so that to address the varying need around different districts, depending on where they were or you know what their situation was. This was deemed overly complicated by the legislature, and they recently changed that to what they call a block grant, which I would assume basically is strictly by numbers. You get allotted by numbers, so the districts that are wealthy, that have a lot of high property values, they went out on that because they generally are going to get more money using the block grant system. The districts that have high need, they're the ones that are going to suffer. So basically what we asked on this survey was how the respondent felt like this new change in the formula affected the quality of education in their area, and the results were not good. Over half said that they feel like they're paying higher costs, because this is what happens. You cut funding, the schools now have to start charging you fees, charging the parents fees, but they got to make it up some way. So obviously they did that.
Or if they can't put in fees, they start laying off teachers, and as a byproduct of that, nearly 2/3
That hits
of
at
the
the quality
respondents
of
said
education.
that the quality of their children's education was being reduced as a result of this less spending. So there's a support for more spending, but we'll get to that in a little bit. You go on ahead.
Go ahead, why don't you take it?
You want the SSM? Okay. While we're on non-controversial issues, let's talk about same-sex marriage. And the U.S. Supreme Court has been putting a few cases in place that tend to set the stage for what will probably be within the next 10 years a general ban on state limitations on same-sex marriage. There is as much of a middle ground as people want to believe is possible. They're trying to stake that out. So you see that less than 1/3 of our respondents are opposed to any manner of legal marriage for same-sex couples. 21% favor civil unions, and then we've got nearly a majority who favor full legal marriage rights. So people look at Kansas and they say a very conservative state, but we're almost at a majority favoring same-sex marriage. And this tracks with state polls in other red states like Kansas, 7 others. Clearly a societal tide seems to be changing, and that's only slightly softened by the fact that there is a bit more support for private businesses who may decide to discriminate against same-sex couples. Even that is starting to drop. The trajectory is downwards. And now we're at the point where a majority say that a private business should be compelled to provide services to same-sex couples regardless of religious objection to doing so.
Now, by provide services, you're saying do business with them.
This is the infamous cake ban. This
Yeah,
is,
yeah, that's exactly what
my bakery won't bake a cake for your lesbian wedding. And what 51% of Kansas Speaks respondents said is you should not be allowed to deny them that service. You should be forced to make the cake for their wedding.
Isn't that unconstitutional?
What's that?
Isn't that unconstitutional? To
No.
force someone to do business?
Actually, no. In fact, when you look back at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many of the same arguments were being made. There were businesses, hotels, restaurants, and so on in the South that were denying service to African Americans. And they made that very case. This is, against my values or against my religion. I should be allowed to do that. And over again, the Supreme Court said you cannot. The factors by which you can choose to not do business with someone must not be based on race. And now we add to that the criteria of same-sex marriage, LGBTQ self-identity in that way. So it's fairly consistent with quite a bit of case law from the Supreme Court over time.
And religion is so varied, it's very easy. If I want to discriminate against blacks, all I have to say is, I don't want to serve the descendants of Ishmael. That's part of my religion. And that gives me religious justification for discriminating against a race.
To me,
Or I
don't
could say the
wanna make a
Jews.
cake for you, buy a cake from somebody who does.
So what if you really like the cake?
That's what occurred to me when I first, why would anybody buy a wedding cake from someone who did not want to make
Yeah,
it?
yeah, to me, that, I don't understand.
Well,
either side of it, forcing them into it or wanting to pay them money.
What your statement is predicated upon is the fact that there are multiple providers in any one particular community. What if you're in a small community and there's only, what if Augustine's was the only bakery here in Hayes? And I don't want to pick on Chad and Holly because this is a theoretical thing, but that's a bakery I know. If they were to say, we refuse, and there's no one else in town, then you're substantively being denied the right to have this at your, to have a cake at your wedding. And that may seem trivial, but those are important symbolic statements that we have, and they're a sign of a measure of what society perceives equality to be. And society now believes that the freedom from non-discrimination is as strong for same-sex couples as it is for African Americans, as it is for Muslims and any other what we call protected class. So that's.
Yeah, and nobody likes to be stigmatized because that's what it is. If you walk it, well, we don't serve your kind. Regardless of the fact that I can go somewhere else, that hurts me and it makes me feel like you're saying to me I'm a substandard.
Reminds me, I'm sick of being fat shamed by you people. Round is a shape after all.
Somebody does not like me because I'm fat. Just do odds.
Chap, if you want, why don't you take voter fraud too? That's a little bit more in your area of specialty.
Okay. Well, Governor Brownback is not the only divisive and controversial figure that we have here in Kansas. And we have Secretary of State Kobach. And he's become a national leader in what's known as the True the Vote movement. In many ways, the data suggest, and I've been fortunate to be part of a couple of studies with some colleagues at Emporia State and Eastern Illinois University. We've been looking at the data. We don't know where this fraud is that Secretary Kobach is looking for. And he managed to get himself prosecutorial power, and he's prosecuted a couple of cases, and generally the courts have rebuffed him, and he started again. But there is this question about whether maybe the public perceives voter fraud to be a real thing, and therefore he's giving the people what they want. But again, there's a grand inconsistency between what the people are saying and what our elected officials are saying, because only 18% of people believe it is a major problem, 47% say it's a minor problem, and just about twice of the people who say it's major say that it's no problem at all. But what people do have, generally speaking, is good confidence in the management and administration of Kansas elections to be pretty fair and to minimize fraud in the first place, because 3/4 of people are happy with the way that elections are administered, with or without the vote fraud pieces, such as requiring the showing of a birth certificate to prove citizenship upon registration, or on showing a current photo ID when actually going to cast a ballot in a polling place. So a big disconnect there between what we're seeing from elected officials and what we're hearing from the public. And so if this is something that is interesting to you, North Carolina passed an even more stringent voter ID law than what we have here in Kansas, and it's going through a court challenge right now. So North Carolina, True the Vote, do a search on that and follow along with it. It'll be interesting to see what the courts say about that.
Jeff, do you know what is the restriction that they're looking at? You say more restriction.
It's the requirement to show a birth certificate on registration. That's the big one. And then there's the photo ID at the polling place, which is an issue but a much smaller one and a much easier to overcome. But that proof of citizenship, that's been the one that's really brought the feds into it, because the federal government has no such requirement. This is state only. And so when the federal government said that Kobach's proof of citizenship rule violated the federal standards, he basically created a two-tiered voting system. You could show up, register to vote, and be eligible in federal elections only, but you could not be eligible in state. And that's one of the things that the courts are looking at, is whether that is or actually the courts have decided that is not legitimate. So he's going back to the drawing board to figure out how he can get this in place with the determinations that the courts have made so far. So yeah, it's a bit of a chase. Yeah, Aaron.
He says about the showing a photo ID at the actual polling place.
Yeah.
Was it less?
It's not as much an impediment. When we look at the data about who tried to register, who were on what were called the suspension list, 18,000, about 3/4 of them were people who didn't have access to a birth certificate. And to order one is a $25 cost, usually takes a little while. People who vote or who register close to the deadline may, even if they have the money and can spend it, they may not get the birth certificate in time to validate their registration for that particular voting. So the folks who have who lack voter ID and get turned away from the polls or get on a suspension list, that's a much smaller chunk of the people. So I'm just talking quantitative there.
We attempted on a previous Kansas Speaks to measure who was affected by that, and our results in Kansas were it was almost, the vast majority were elderly. Because they suspected students. We did not find any evidence of that students were affected by it. These data are kind of difficult to interpret because for the longest time, Secretary Kobach was professing that there were these illegal aliens that were coming in and voting. And that was his main rationale for these new extreme voting requirements. And he was more recently given power to prosecute, and I think he's prosecuted 6 cases, Chapman. None of them have been illegal aliens, and almost all of them have been cases. Cases where people had just moved or they had dual residency in a different state, and they tried to vote in local elections. So, so there was all that, but
and it was an interesting side note with the data, and we had to file a FOIA request and pay to get this data. If you look at the party of registration of most folks, a lot of people like to assume something quite sinister, and they say, oh, well, he's a Republican, he's trying to suppress Democratic votes. Well, if that's the case, he should be stopping immediately, because there were 15% more Republicans who were put on the suspense list than there were Democrats. So it disproportionately hurt voters of his own party.
So that's kind of where we were measuring whether there was a problem, and we expected people to say that there wasn't. But it was either right before or during our data collection that you've heard about the incident with the WSU statistics professor who thought she found some discrepancies in the voting, and she tried to access the raw data from Secretary Kobach to perform the test that she needed, and he basically said that it was illegal for him to do that, would not provide her with that. So that's
We're anxiously awaiting that court decision.
So that kind of does create a legitimate suspicion that there's voter fraud. So that's why we never really know how much of the respondents' response is from their knowledge of of Secretary Kobach or their knowledge of this WSU professor. Immigration. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
About the voting, actually. So I was wondering if somebody is required to get a birth certificate, and then that birth certificate costs $25 or whatever it is in order to get the copy, could that be construed as a poll tax?
That would be something that I think is a reasonable argument. And unfortunately, what would have to happen is, to establish standing, someone would have to register, go back, get the birth certificate, complete the registration, and then sue. Until they have been denied the opportunity, they do not have standing to sue. So it would have to be decided by the courts. Because Kobach believes that no, everyone should have access to their birth certificate, so it does not constitute a poll tax. Everyone gets one copy for free. You get it from your folks, that's it. But of course, they get lost, burned up in fires, what have you. But
How many of you in here could bring me your birth certificate by 7 o'clock tonight?
the rest of you turn your voter reg cards in right now. But I only say that slightly tongue in cheek, because that is the barrier. He does believe that unless you can produce a birth certificate on demand, you should not be allowed the right to vote. That's it. Yeah.
Would you like to entertain a question from Twitter?
Sure.
Somebody who's not here. It's pretty easy. It's kind of a rhetorical question.
Okay.
How can we have democracy without each citizen's participation and voice?
We can.
140 characters short.
We can. And actually, my presentation at Convocation this fall was about that very thing. That's my upcoming book, is making that case that we like to complain about our elected officials, but we, the voters, with our lack of engagement, our lack of connection to politics, our misinformation to uninformed status, and the steadily dropping voter turnout rates, plus you add in lower rates of trust among elected officials, lower satisfaction rates with all of them, and we'll see that here in Kansas. People are kind of an unguided missile right now, and we're engaged in a state of operator error, is what I claim it to be. So what we hope happens is that people not only participate in these polls, and they not only share pithy memes on their Facebook walls and their Twitter feeds, but that they communicate these things and these preferences to their elected officials. Because part of the reason that elected officials listen to lobbyists and each other and their party leaders is because those messages aren't being drowned out by us. We're assuming that they hear us, but we're just talking amongst ourselves. We're not talking with them. So there's a huge disconnect between where the public is and where the government is. Fellow back there had a quick question.
One more thing on this voter fraud, which I did not mention in the first college. Some of us in here have only known that when you go to vote, you must have some sort of proof of who you are. However, before that, it was merely a matter of signing an affidavit that if it is brought to light that you are not in fact the person you say you are when you vote, you are subject to federal prosecution. Why it is that there has been a move from that sort of penalty to any restrictions, whether it be federal ID requirements or anything else, I personally don't know why there has been that.
Well, in some ways, the photo ID requirement makes a bit of sense. You have to have photo ID for any number of things that you might do in your daily life. And if we are really worried about voter fraud, then having a photo ID is probably one of the best bulwarks against voter fraud. But the same argument that you made about a birth certificate, if you're in an urban area, you don't own a car, you could make about someone needing a photo ID then. There's a fee that you'd have to pay to get an ID card or a driver's license. And so, that could be a poll tax.
Well, what about people who get like state IDs if they don't have cars?
And that would have to factor in.
Well, I mean,
I think there's still a
when they get
cost.
it in general, like when they turn 18 or 21 and for various reasons, or for like colleges that want your state ID for things.
It'd be great if university IDs could be used as well, because one of those things is, depending on how strict a local election official wants it to be, as college students, you all move around a bit. You may keep your hometown address on your driver's license, but there will be some elected officials, some chief elections officers in counties, who will say that if your current address, the one at which you're registered, isn't the one on your driver's license, that's not a valid form of photo ID for you to for you to vote. And there have been cases all over where folks in college towns don't like the undergraduates voting, and that becomes a little mild form of voter suppression that they engage in. So it's not something as simple as, here's a card with my picture on it. It depends on how narrowly those things get drawn.
Okay, we got a lot more good stuff,
yeah,
so
exactly.
let's move on.
We can pick this stuff up more.
Immigration, we kind of already talked a little bit about that with Secretary Kobach. You know, that he basically said that illegal immigration is a big problem. It's, you know, they're coming in, taking our jobs, they're using up our social services and not paying taxes. And of course, this does not address that, but it basically just is talking about people's opinion of illegal immigrants. And you can see that only 13%, or I'm sorry, only 9%. Actually, this is not illegal aliens. As you can see, this is higher illegal aliens. You know, we asked this because it just seemed like to us that most of the policies designed to address illegal aliens are targeting the actual people, persons that are just coming here to look for work. It is just as illegal for an employer to hire an illegal immigrant.
Someone may think that they were trying to fill the budget hole made by the tax rates by fining employers of undocumented individuals, because more than half of the respondents say that that there should be a punishment and that the appropriate punishment is a fine.
And you do see isolated cases where these employers are prosecuted, but it's nowhere near to the degree that the illegal immigrants are. So you can see here what this shows is that 9% would want a prison fine for someone who knowingly hired an illegal immigrant, and way over half would want at least a significant fine for hiring an illegal immigrant.
Other way.
Okay. Amnesty. In other words, this is referring to the undocumented immigrants. We asked about them, and which of the best describes your opinion regarding how we should deal with undocumented immigrants. The official policy, this is straight from the Republican platform website, regarding immigration, we oppose amnesty, and of course, a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants with no criminal record, which, I don't know if you can equate that to amnesty, but I think most people would say it's very similar.
It's a good
over
middle
half,
ground.
over half favor a path to citizenship for the illegal immigrants in Kansas. Only 1/4 would follow this policy that the legislature is deporting all of the illegal undocumented immigrants. You want to take marijuana, or you want me to?
Well, I'll take the policy. I mean, we're not moving to
I'll take
Colorado.
marijuana anytime.
Okay. I can go to him. Neighboring Colorado, a lot has been made about their tax revenue off recreational marijuana, whether that's something that should be applied here in Kansas. Attorney General Schmidt has been very aggressive in prosecuting cases where marijuana comes over from Colorado. And you find that there's a groundswell of support building here in the state of Kansas. We saw it in the ballot initiative in Wichita to decriminalize marijuana. Almost 2/3 of the state of Kansas favor a full decriminalization, and you add another 5% to that, and you get people who approve it for medical use. So still strong majorities on both sides favor significant relaxation of the penalties against marijuana usage here in the state of Kansas.
Right, keep in mind, this is not the same thing as legalization. This is not like Colorado. Decriminalization means that you just couldn't be arrested or go to jail for it. It would be like a ticket that you could get. You didn't mention that there was a recent initiative in Wichita.
Yeah.
Could you tell me quickly about that?
Yeah, there was a ballot measure on the 2014 ballot to decriminalize, basically to take the penalties down.
Within Wichita city limits,
within,
right?
Yeah, within the city limits of Wichita. It did not pass, but it came close. So there's clearly more support out there, and that's another one of those things where attitudes seem to be changing over time. We're seeing the trend.
And even if it had passed, you still would have state laws against it. So it would have been kind of like the situation with Colorado and the United States. It is still federal laws against using marijuana, but President Obama and the current administration has decided any state that legalizes it, he's going to keep the feds out of it. Of course, that could change. We could get a new president, he could rescind that and start prosecuting. How many of you from Colorado? None. But yeah, they could turn around that, and people in Colorado, they could shut down all those stores overnight if the federal government wanted to. Gun policy. How many of you took the gun survey? Okay. This is actually from Kansas Speaks. The recent Kansas Speaks, we asked a similar question to what you got asked, whether they oppose or favor allowing guns on concealed carry, I should say.
Yeah, this is constitutional carry. This is being able to allow or to carry concealed weapons without a license or a certificate of formal training. So that's what's known as constitutional carry, according to the legislation that got through the Kansas legislature last year. And as you can see, we're pretty strong move against it. 3/4 of the respondents to Kansas Speaks said that they opposed constitutional carry. Most Kansans
this is
support.
without a license or certification.
That's the point I was just about to make, is that most people favor concealed carry, but with training and with a certification of such.
And a strong, I think over 90% of the students said, well, if we have guns on campus, we definitely want them to be licensed and certified. And this is kind of, as you may know, ex-state representative Travis Couture-Lovelady was largely the one that spearheaded this. Ironically, he now, I think, works as a lobbyist for the gun industry or for the NRA. And so basically, only 25% of Kansans favor this policy that has been imposed on us. Okay, so here are the results of the campus gun survey. This one on the left is, this is for the, let's see, the faculty were more opposed, so that'll be the faculty and staff over there, and then this is the students. And a couple of interesting things here we saw was the variation in support. Notice that Fort Hays had the lowest percentage that wanted to ban guns on campus and the highest percentage that wanted to allow concealed carry. Pittsburgh State similarly to us. But then on the other end of the spectrum, KU Medical Center and Emporia all had the highest percentages favoring banning guns, and subsequently the lowest percentages wanting to allow guns on campus.
And that tracks over, as you might imagine, being a Western Kansas institution, we've got a lot of folks, I know a lot of students, a lot of faculty who are gun owners, who are hunters, and so we're going to be generally a more gun ownership friendly campus, and we're probably not going to see it as that significant a threat here as they are going to at KU, KUMC, and even Emporia. But still, the numbers are pretty strongly, especially on faculty side, against. And you can see even stronger on the faculty side than on the student side, supporting amendment of the law so that guns are not allowed on campus. Right now, the law is that if you want to ban guns from your campus, you have to install metal detectors, and that is an unfunded mandate. So there's no university looking at all the budget cuts that are coming down are going to be able to put forth the millions of dollars to do that. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. So would you say that the closer to eastern Kansas or larger cities, the less likely students are to not want to have guns around compared to people who are more in
Absolutely.
country/small city /small town areas?
To some degree, but Wichita State was, I think most people would agree, it's in a bad part of town. I mean, Wichita State is the place that is the most threatened, I think. But you see that they are not the strongest supporters of guns. They kind of fall into the middle. So I think there are other factors. I think students are generally drawn to I think, liberal students are drawn to KU, conservative students may be drawn to Pitt and Fort Hays State. But wasn't it interesting
too? I think the line is drawn right here, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Wichita State, KUMC, Emporia, which is in a small town, but it's still smack in the middle of all these semi-urban areas in KU. And then you've got Manhattan, you've got Pitt, and you've got Hays. Just smaller towns, more rural. It's going to be more of a hunting culture.
Right.
And I think that chalks it
That's
up
definitely
a
a
lot.
factor,
I think it's a huge explanatory
And
factor.
isn't it interesting how the order stays pretty much the same? In other words, the KU professors and the students are both the most liberal, and the Fort Hays Students and professors are the most conservative with regard to guns. It's really just a tendency for the faculty and staff to have higher levels of opposition than the students.
Basically, the faculty don't think about as much of the students' marksmanship as the students do.
I'm going to let you take this one, Chap.
We're angry! We don't know why. Well, we don't like anybody. Here's politician X, hate him. Here's politician Y, hate him more. Here's politician Z, she's the worst.
Jerry Moran's still doing okay.
Jerry Moran is doing fine. He's got more than 40% approval on the by the people, and only a generic state senator comes even close there. Otherwise, everyone else is below 30% in a generic approval rating. And I should mention, Brownback, Moran, Roberts, most likely their legislator, Republicans in a Republican state. So even if you've got a person of your own party in there, you still don't like them. And this trends nationwide, all over, getting back to the question that came in on Twitter. People don't trust politicians, they don't like them, and they think very, very negatively of them. Interestingly enough, we re-elect them 95% of the time. So we talk a good game. But that's the real takeaway here, is that we say we don't like people, we say we're very dissatisfied, but look at Governor Brownback, 18% satisfied. And yet just a year ago, he had won re-election in a hotly contested race. So President Obama, 28% satisfied.
Who did better, Governor Brownback or President Obama?
President Obama. Chew on that one for a little
That got
bit.
us a lot of national attention this time. A lot of national attention from that particular result.
But really, when you can say that President Obama is beating Brownback, but he's at 28%, are there any winners here? No, not really. And again, it comes back to the fact that whenever you ask people about an elected official, their response is going to be negative. That's the temperature of the population today.
Another thing we constantly notice is my own state legislator and senator are good people, but it's the other people. You'll notice you get higher ratings for their own senator and representative, but the legislature as a whole, they're the problem. My guys are the only two good guys in there.
And let me piggyback with that, because these numbers are in the low 40s. Those numbers used to be in the high 60s and low 70s. So even that sense that I like my congressman, but the other, or my legislator, but the other 164 of them are idiots. Now it's, I tolerate my state legislature, and the other 164 of them are idiots. The comparative approval for our own legislator has come down a lot. So rather than familiarity breeding approval, it's bred contempt. And when you look at this over time, because we've been doing this since 2009, so we've excerpted out the four most recent years, and you can see that despite a little bit of a blip upwards here, the trend is still quite generally downward in terms of dissatisfaction. We go from 40% to more than 50% dissatisfaction with the Kansas legislature, and well, the Brownback numbers, if there's anything that Sam Brownback has to be happy about, it's that he's term limited out, because he dodged a bullet in 2014. 2018 trajectory does not look good for his popularity, because he's at 69% disapproval. Go on ahead.
Okay, that's the end of our results. We would just like to wrap up by talking about what you can do to make Kansas a more open and democratic society. You know, we've already talked about voting is very important, but I would almost argue that this is really the first thing that you have to worry about. I'm really reluctant to say I want uninformed people to go vote, because it really doesn't mean anything, and it can actually be counterproductive if you base your vote on just something by some political ad you've seen, or by something a strong conservative or liberal has told you.
Or you just like
need
their
to be
hair.
informed. Read the newspaper. Find some political blogs that you watch. You know, cable's got some great news. One thing I think Chap would agree, you have to watch out because there are very biased sources of news now on both sides. And my fear is that more and more people are just migrating to just one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, you only get one side. You don't get people that challenge the ideas that are being put forth. So make sure you get an eclectic source of your news, and then use that news to go vote and vote for the person that you think is best. Even more than that, get involved in campaign. And that takes more time and maybe more of your money, but that's the way. You know, one vote is nothing. You rarely have influence, but you could go out and you get 20, 30, 40 people to vote, convince them to vote your way. That is political power right there in the hands of the common citizen.
Whenever a person would go to vote, generally the ballots are for so many offices, right? A person doesn't have to think of it as though it were an exam where you at least should guess at everything. If you are not aware of any of the candidates for any particular office, feel free to not vote for any of them.
Good point.
Yeah. Or if you've done your homework and you don't like any of them, write in none of the above. And perhaps you've heard this one before, but a lot of people choose to not vote when they're dissatisfied with the candidates. And unfortunately, all that is a stamp of approval. It says, keep doing exactly what you're doing. The only accountability mechanism you have to hold over an elected official's head is the ability to remove them from office with that ballot. And so if you don't vote, it's the same as saying, keep doing what you're doing because you're not voting for somebody else. But if people would realize what a sleeping giant they were, if they would organize, and so they would select a person or the specific language, none of the above. Let's say people would say voting for none of the above. They would write that in because every ballot gives a write-in possibility. And all of those people, all of those unguided missiles who stay home and vote or they roll off, if they voted for none of the above, and suddenly 15, 20% of the voting public voted none of the above in a given race, do you think a person who lost by 10% wouldn't be wondering what I need to do to get those folks on my side next time? Absolutely. Use your vote the same way you use anything else, as an informational mechanism and tool. But we have to be smart about those things. We have to orient ourselves towards politics, like what Gary was saying. If you're conservative and you watch Fox News, that's great. But every now and again, even if you don't want to, you've got to get your heart rate up and tune in MSNBC and watch Rachel Maddow. You may go and throw up, but you need to do it. You need to understand what the other side is saying so that you can both counter those arguments and respect where they're coming from. Instead, what we tend to do is pull back into our own little echo chambers. And this goes on both sides, because liberals who watch MSNBC need to watch Fox News occasionally as well. See what the other side is saying, understand the argument, and at the very least respect it. There's one of the things that slide about the dissatisfaction shows you. We have a respect deficit for each other. We don't respect that which we disagree with, and we have to understand that, accept that, and deal with it. We don't now. We shout at each other and we run off to our own little sides. And very rarely do we come together to resolve things. That's the really dangerous part, is that we don't use these great avenues that we have, the surfeit of social media that's out there today. We use that, and I'm guilty of this occasionally as well.